Welcome to Understanding Russia's Invasion of Ukraine with Dr. Yoshiko Herrera. My name is Tanya Misselt. I'm the director of the River Falls Public Library. Thank you everyone for joining us. Tonight's program is streaming live and being recorded for later viewing on the River Falls Public Library Facebook page and on our YouTube channel. At the end of the presentation, we will have time for some questions and answers. Dr. Yoshiko Herrera is a professor of political science at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Her research interests include politics in Russia and Eurasia, nationalism, xenophobia, and social identities. She received her BA from Dartmouth College and her PhD from the University of Chicago. She taught at Harvard University before moving to UW-Madison in 2007. At UW, she is a past director of the Center for Russia, East Europe, and Central Asia from 2011 to 2014. She's a former co-director of the International Institute from 2012 to 2015, and former director of the UW-Madison Partnership with Nazarbayev University in Kazakhstan from 2012 to 2018. She has ongoing research projects related to violent extremism in Russia, interethnic trust, identity and censorship, U.S.-Russian relations, and race and gender in Russia. She teaches classes on post-communist politics, comparative politics, and social identities. Please welcome Dr. Yoshiko Herrera. Thank you so much for taking time tonight to be with us.
Thank you very much for having me. I'm really happy to talk to your community here. I'm going to try to give a little bit of background on the conflict in Ukraine that everybody is probably watching on TV. And I'm going to start with actually discussing some of the background factors that led up to this invasion of Ukraine. And I think that's partly to give people an understanding of how we got here. But I want to preface the discussion of background factors or explanations with the following, which is that the decision to invade Ukraine really was Vladimir Putin's decision. And that decision, it was made on February 24th. It could have been a different decision. Russia could have done something differently. There were lots of diplomatic off-ramps. And so I just want to be clear that it was in no way inevitable. And by talking about background factors, I don't mean to excuse the responsibility for the invasion, excuse Putin for responsibility in the invasion. But I think it's helpful to understand some of the thinking that may have led us here. And I'm going to talk about three factors. One is about this narrative of the 1990s and what happened in Russia following the end of the Soviet Union. Another is about why Ukraine. What is the specific threat of Ukraine, or why did Putin feel Ukraine was a threat? And the third is about Putin's, what I call his imperial ambitions, or the kind of nationalist sentiments that animate his thinking. So I want to get into that and then get into some of the consequences and what comes next. This picture from last week, that's the Kharkiv National University building. And it's just one of many of the pictures of devastation that we're seeing in Ukraine. And so I just want to emphasize that we're right in the middle of this tragedy for Ukraine. So I want to be sensitive to that. But I think it's helpful to understand just a bit of how we got here. Okay, let me start with the 1990s. You might have heard on the news that McDonald's has just decided to pull out of Russia by shutting down its more than 800 franchise restaurants. This image on the screen is a picture from the opening of McDonald's when it opened to great fanfare in Moscow in 1990. Those are lines of people who were waiting hours to try out McDonald's for the first time. Some people would say, well, good riddance, I'm not a fan of McDonald's, etc. But I just want to note that it actually has a lot of symbolic relevance, because the opening of McDonald's was not just about the food. It was about Russia joining the world, about Russia things that were available in other places like Levi's, Coca-Cola, etc., also being available in Russia. And it was kind of a symbol of the opening up of Russia to the West, and better relations and shared interests and things like that. But the lines in the picture also tell another part of the story of the 1990s, is that the 1990s were this period of severe economic decline in Russia. There were deficits of all kinds of items, so people had to wait in line in stores for all manner of things: toilet paper, flour, meat. Some things were not available, and there was high inflation. So prices were high, goods were in short supply, and there was a lot of lines in what is referred to now as a kind of chaos of the 1990s. So one of the important things actually that Putin has built his power base on is saying that unlike the 1990s, when he came to power starting at the beginning, late 1999, beginning of 2000, that the 1990s were behind them, that they were no longer going to have this chaos, these lines, and also the inequality, the oligarchs that came out of it. He was going to do something about that and make Russia a better place for ordinary Russians. In the early 2000s, Russia had almost a decade of double-digit economic growth, largely because of high oil and gas prices. And Russia, a lot of its earnings come from, or over half its GDP actually comes from oil and gas. So Putin rode this wave of high oil prices. And if you contrast the 2000s with the 1990s, it looks like, wow, as soon as Putin came to power, everything started getting better. And so that was one of the cornerstones of his self-narrative, of his rule. And so I just want to note that this closing of McDonald's and the possibility of very high inflation in Russia right now, deficits of goods in a way, is very undermining of his regime, because it's a reminder to people that although he said, the 90s were behind them, they're actually in some ways coming back to that level of economic deprivation. Another part of the narrative of Putin's view on the 1990s was that after the end of the Soviet Union, Russia did everything it was supposed to do. It reined in the nuclear weapons from the former Soviet states, which was a shared objective actually of both Russia and the United States and other nuclear powers, because we didn't want a proliferation of states with nuclear weapons, multiple decision points about nuclear weapons. Russia, from their perspective, allowed the reunification of East Germany and West Germany. They moved their troops out of Eastern Europe. And what they see as responsible international behavior actually was met with NATO enlargement. And so the NATO enlargement issue goes back to the 90s, and it goes back to the issue of this suffering, and what did Russia get in return for this kind of suffering and humiliation and apologizing in international affairs. They got what they consider a greater threat, not just a threat from NATO, but a humiliation that they knew. They made clear they didn't like NATO expansion, but it was made clear to them that they didn't have a choice in the matter. So although the 90s are a period of democratization in Russia and economic reform, in many ways, for a lot of Russians, the 90s were delegitimizing of democracy and economic reform because of the high inequality and because of the period of democracy is associated with this chaos, whereas when Putin comes to power in the 2000s and Russia becomes less democratic, that less democratic period is associated with greater economic growth. In addition, there's this idea among the Putin supporters that Russia was on its knees in the 90s, that Russia was humiliated, and that this carried through into the 2000s. There's different ways that they mention this, but also remember that 9/11 happened in 2001, and the world sort of united behind the United States and the global war on terrorism. And this is kind of a period of increasing American power, even though America was under attack from terrorism. The US acted, from the Russian point of view, somewhat unilaterally, even though there was UN support and NATO support and different things. The Iraq War, the Afghanistan War, Kosovo, Libya. The Russian side puts all these things together as part of increasing American strength. And also, the US actually pulled out of not just arms control treaties, namely the ABM treaty, but just completely stopped talking to the Russians about arms control, which they also found very humiliating because they wanted to be recognized as a great power, as an important player. And a lot of the 2000s was about showing that America, Europe did not care about Russian interests. They took very much. They were very. The Russian side was very upset when President Obama called them a regional power. But on the other hand, Russia did actually support the U.S. in some important ways in the global war on terrorism, namely allowing air transport center in Kyrgyzstan, which is one of the former Soviet states in Central Asia, and allowing the U.S. To fly planes over Russia. And almost all U.S. troops in and out of Afghanistan went through that air transport center in Kyrgyzstan. So that was actually an important piece of cooperation. And there was cooperation with Iran, with the Iran nuclear deal. But from the Russian and Putin perspective, they feel like from their perspective, they played along with the rules, but what they got in return was disrespect. So that's one piece of it. But the thing I want to emphasize is that it's not that NATO actually presented a military threat to Russia via Ukraine, but that NATO expansion and the potential for Ukraine to join NATO is part of this sense of disrespect and humiliation. So I think there's more of an emotional aspect to it than an actual objective security threat. Okay, but that takes us to Ukraine. Like, why is Ukraine important? Why is Ukraine per se such a problem for Putin? So in addition to being one of the former Soviet states, Ukraine has had two successful social revolutions, one in 2004 and one in 2014. Both times this is from the 2004 Orange Revolution, both times people rose up to kick out pro-Russian politician, actually the same person, Viktor Yanukovych, and replace that person with a more pro-Western, pro-Ukrainian nationalist politician. And this was very irritating to Putin in 2004, but even more so in 2014, because he was losing popularity on his own. And he was very worried about the example of Ukraine as a democratic state and as a state in which a social revolution can produce democracy. So Ukraine and the example of democracy was particularly vexing to Putin and his inner circle. But also, going back to the humiliation narrative, stopping Ukraine from joining NATO is a way of redoing the humiliation of the 1990s. Whereas Russia was not able to stop the Baltic states, others from joining NATO, in 2014, Putin was really set on showing that now Russia would have a say in Ukraine's affairs, that Russia was not going to sit by and just watch. But the issue with Ukraine, again, is not that Ukraine was threatening to attack Russia, or that Ukraine per se is militarily superior or something like that to Russia. It's that it's just the opposite. But it's that symbolically Ukraine is a very similar country to Russia, and Putin was worried about the example of Ukraine. And that gets us to my third point in terms of the background, which has to do with the shared history between Russia and Ukraine. So something that's really important to understand is that Russia and Ukraine have a centuries-old shared history They're both Orthodox countries. Ukraine had some brief period of sovereignty in the 1920s, and then it became a fully independent state in 1991. The Russian and Ukrainian languages are both Slavic languages. They share about 30% of their vocabulary. And there are a lot of people in Russia who have Ukrainian, tens of millions of people in Russia have relatives living in Ukraine, or they may be ethnic Russian or ethnic Ukrainian relatives. There's a lot of intermarriage. Most of Ukraine is Russian speaking. If you've seen the president of Ukraine, Zelensky, he can speak both Ukrainian and Russian. He grew up in the eastern part of Ukraine where there's a lot of Russian speakers and ethnic Russians. So there's a lot of overlap in terms of families and shared history in terms of Russians and Ukrainians. And I think it's important to note that this is not a case of a long-standing historical animus where the two ethnic groups really hate each other. It's actually a case where there's quite a lot of overlap and quite a lot of history. I know some people are going to disagree with this, but you might liken it to thinking about English and Irish identities that, certain coming up on St. Patrick's Day. Certainly there's people that are going to be very adamant about Irish identity, but, there can be a sort of competitive sportsman-like relationship between the two. And there's a lot of overlap in terms of people's genetic and family histories. So it's not one where you can easily separate families or separate people. Putin, however, in the last few years, developed more and more this idea of this greater Russia that kind of harkens back to the Russian Empire. And that is a view that says, even though Ukraine is a sovereign state since 1991, Putin rejects that and thinks of Ukraine as part of Russia. Belarus the same way, and some of the other former Soviet states. Although with Belarus, Putin has an ally, and some of the other Central Asian states, such as Kazakhstan, you may recall that was kind of a crisis maybe a month ago when there was demonstrations in Kazakhstan against the government, and they actually called in Russian troops to put down those demonstrations. So some of the states are friendlier, but some have been less interested in being part of the Russian sphere of influence, namely Georgia and Ukraine. But I think a way to think about Putin's view of Ukraine is not as Ukrainians as others, but as apostate Russians. That is, they're like Russians, but they're doing the wrong thing. They are moving westward. They want to have democracy, etc. And so we need to rein them in. But this misses a really important aspect of Ukrainian identity, and I think one of the most important things in the current conflict, which is that although I've been talking about Ukraine and Russia having this shared history, there are a couple of events that are critical for Ukrainian national identity. And the first one is what Ukrainians call the Holodomor, which is, from the Ukrainian perspective, a genocide caused by a famine under Stalin in 1932 and 33. So during collectivization, there were grain requisitions that caused a famine. The Soviet side is that a lot of people died, but it was an accident. The Ukrainian side is that this is a genocide. So this Holodomor, this sense of genocide by the Soviet Union of Ukrainians and of the Ukrainian nation, is a central facet of Ukrainian national identity. There's no Ukrainian who says, oh, I don't know about that incident. I'm not sure. Everyone knows about it. Everybody understands that there was this time when the Soviet Union, from the Ukrainian perspective, tried to wipe out the Ukrainian nation. And so because of that, they're extremely sensitive to the idea of being under Soviet or Russian control again. And that's why I think many observers, including myself, thought that the idea of Russia taking over Ukraine and getting Ukrainians to agree to that is just almost zero, because there's just so much widespread resistance to Russian or Soviet control, and Putin, sort of a Soviet type person. Another thing is that in 2014, when Russia took Crimea, part of Ukraine, that episode was very embarrassing for Ukraine, and it actually caused a unification within the country of both Ukrainian and Russian speakers against Russia because they were so outraged by the infringement on their sovereignty. So if you combine the Holodomor and the 2014 seizure of Crimea, what you have is a very united Ukraine against reimposition of Russian or a Soviet-style rule. And that's what you're seeing in terms of the resilience and fighting spirit of Ukrainians right now. I think that Ukrainian resolve is very predictable. And it's kind of a testament of the flawed decision-making process on the part of Putin that he thought that Ukrainian support for any kind of a coup. Okay, so as I've tried to suggest, I think that what we're seeing on Russia's part was just a massive miscalculation, maybe like one of the worst decisions. I don't know, people try to think what's the worst decision in history or in terms of a leader, why did he do this? I think it's just a massive miscalculation that has been not only a tragedy for Ukraine, but a catastrophe for Russia. But where was Putin wrong? He was wrong, as I was just mentioning, about the Ukrainian resolve, thinking that Ukrainians would welcome Russian troops. He may have thought Zelensky, who, by the way, used to be a comedian and an actor, he actually played a character in a TV show who was a comedian that gets elected president. So it's just a strange irony that he actually is president. Putin may have underestimated him and thought he would flee or give up power easily, but obviously he hasn't. And Ukrainians are showing that although there's a lot of refugees that have left, there's a lot of people who stayed to fight. In addition, I think Putin was buoyed by his belief that Russia had been very successful in previous military episodes. First, there were actually two Chechen wars within Russia. Chechnya is a republic of Russia. And I think something that's important is in the second Chechen war that started in 1999, when Putin came to power, they used massive force, just leveling the capital city of Chechnya, Grozny. But this happened largely after 9/11, when the world was distracted with other things and there wasn't a lot of media attention outside of Russia, and Putin to some extent had a free reign. In Georgia in 2008, it's a somewhat complicated story, but Georgia thought might get US NATO support. They didn't, and they relented, but Russia left troops in Georgia that are still there, and from his perspective, he got away with it. In addition, Crimea, they were able to take part of Ukraine in 2014, and while there were economic sanctions, there wasn't a lot more that was done. And Russia used force in Syria in 2015, series of complicated conflict, but one of the things that they did was inflict massive humanitarian damage and a lot of civilian casualties in Aleppo. And from Putin's perspective, there wasn't very much reaction from the world, and so probably there wouldn't be to this invasion of Ukraine. I don't know how he exactly could draw that conclusion given the amount of diplomatic activity in the months leading up to this and the fact that everybody was watching it. But I think that he was influenced by previous military victories to think that this would be easy. It seems pretty clear that Putin thought that this is going to be like Crimea in 2014, that the Russian troops would just go in and they would have very little resistance, and it would be a little bit of economic damage, but not much else. The sanctions in 2014 actually were targeted towards the regime, and they were specifically targeted towards the regime because the idea in the West was that you didn't want to punish the Russian people for the bad decision-making of Putin. Putin was able to turn that around actually in somewhat sophisticated way, in that he put his own sanctions on food imports from Europe as counter sanctions. And so when French wines and cheeses and things like that disappeared from shelves in Russia, Putin actually blamed the West, even though those were his counter sanctions, but he also portrayed it as like, they think we really care about these luxury items, but we don't, and we're in it for this greater Russian nationhood, etc., which having Crimea was supposed to bring. The Russian government was actually planning in some ways for what they considered sanction proofing their economy by doing things like amassing a huge amount of foreign currency reserves, $630 billion. But what he didn't anticipate was that the US and Europe would work together to stop the Russian central bank from being able to access that money. And so that has effectively caused a financial crisis in Russia because they didn't anticipate those kinds of sanctions. And the scale and scope of the sanctions is basically like nothing we've ever seen before. There's no other comparable case of sanctions. And so many people, including Putin, vastly underestimated how bad the sanctions would be. It's interesting to think about whether he would do the same thing again, knowing what he knows now. But another piece of the puzzle that I think Putin really miscalculated on is the amount of worldwide condemnation of Russia, not just from US and NATO allies, but across Europe, from Switzerland, from the UK. Remember, Brexit was not that long ago. Europe was divided, but also from Asia, from Japan, from Singapore, etc. And although he may be thinking that China is going to support him, there's a lot of indications thus far that China is going to go along with the sanctions. I want to point out in this picture, this is a picture right after the invasion of Putin meeting with his economic advisors. And you can see that this long, excessively long table, which is very strange, kind of highlights the isolation of Putin in his decision-making. I just want to note that like this use of long tables, you saw that with Macron before, French President Macron before the invasion. This was not a normal aspect of Russian politics before. So this long table is kind of a post-COVID thing. Some people think it's because he's worried about getting COVID, but kind of makes you wonder if he's worried about assassination or something like that, because it's so strange. And he's obviously not having cozy conversations with his economic team there. So Putin was just very isolated in his decision-making, maybe as a result of keeping people who were loyal to him rather than people who would actually tell him the truth and say no. But the result was that he was basically wrong about everything. He was wrong about the Ukrainian reaction. He was wrong about the military tactics, wrong on the economic effects, and totally wrong in the worldwide response. Okay, so where does that leave us? If we look at what's next, the upper picture there is a picture of protesters in St. Petersburg over the weekend. Over 13,000 people have been arrested in Russia for protesting this war. There is protest within Russia, although the government has strongly cracked down on that. The economy, that you can't really see it very well, but I had a slide last week that was looking at the Russian ruble, and that's what's behind that red circle. So last week we were talking about what's going to happen to the ruble on Monday when markets open, because the war started on Thursday and there's this immediate economic effect, and the central bank sanctions were announced on the weekend. So what was going to happen to the ruble? And the ruble fell. But as of yesterday, the ruble is no longer a convertible currency. So Russians who have rubles, since the 90s, they were able to take those rubles and go buy foreign currency, buy dollars or euros. They can no longer do that. They're no longer selling rubles on the street at banks in Russia. If you have a foreign currency account at a bank, you can take out up to $10,000 and that's it. So a lot of consumers are suddenly left with no ability to exchange rubles into dollars, and the ruble, that's the way the central bank has dealt with the falling currency value, is to basically make it a non-convertible currency. And that is a huge economic step backwards for Russia as a part of the global economy. There's many other companies that have pulled out, but I want to emphasize it's not just the economic damage, but the the reputation and the expectations about Russia for the future that are seriously called into question. Some people are saying, okay, the sanctions are severe, but look at what Putin's doing. This picture in the middle is just from 2 days ago. That's the hospital in Mariupol, the maternity hospital that was bombed by Putin. So some people are saying, well, sanctions aren't working because look at what he's still doing. But the sanctions have seriously degraded the Russian economy, and they have seriously weakened state capacity in Russia. So in terms of the military's ability to pay salaries, to hire people instead of using conscript soldiers, and the state's ability to pay pensions, to just do all the other things that states do, Russia is in a very serious financial crisis right now. And they're also in a trade crisis with all of the companies refusing to do business with them, including companies that sell needed equipment and parts for manufacturing and the oil and gas industry. So BP and Shell pulled out, Ford has pulled out, other car companies have pulled out, Russian car companies like Avtovaz have closed and things like that. So I would say the war-making ability of the state has been degraded by the sanctions, but the sanctions are not finished. There's still much more that can be done. And the idea about the sanctions is to make every day a bad day for the Russian economy, every day to be a little bit worse than the day before. And I think that some people, it's kind of a big debate right now in academia whether that makes a difference. Will that spur protests of people on the street like we're seeing, or elites to defect from Putin and call for an end to the war? Certainly it's going to cause a lot of dissatisfaction in the country. And I think it's going to be very hard for Putin, despite his control over the media, to explain to people why the Russian economy has been so wrecked in the last 2 weeks. In addition, he has already started cracking down internally within Russia. A few days ago, they passed a law saying that anyone who promotes what he calls fake news can get a 15-year prison sentence. And fake news is anything the government disagrees with. The government has said, like, you can't use the word war, so you can't say you're anti-war or against the war. They call it a special military operation. And they also will prosecute anybody that calls for further sanctions against Russia. And so they basically made it impossible for news companies to operate within Russia. And that's why you see the New York Times, the BBC, basically all the foreign news organizations have pulled out. And Russia has itself shut down Twitter and YouTube, Twitter and Facebook. And so there's less, and they've also shut down the sort of opposition TV channel, and which they highly controlled, but it was a little bit different, and a longtime opposition radio station called Echo of Moscow. So they have absolutely tightened the screws in terms of media control and punishment for protesters. But nevertheless, even in that environment, there's still a lot of people going out on the streets. Will it be enough? I don't know, but it's certainly creating a lot of dissatisfaction in Russia. And that dissatisfaction is also being met with violence, as I mentioned, in terms of the arrests. But unfortunately, what we're seeing in the last few days in Ukraine is more and more violence there, and more violence against civilians. The hospital that was bombed in Mariupol, it's not just the one part of Mariupol. Mariupol as a city is totally cut off in terms of water, food, humanitarian aid, etc. Kharkiv is also largely under siege still. And as you can see from the news reports there, Russian artillery is hitting shells into other locations as well, and around Kiev as well. So there's more and more violence in Ukraine. And what does that mean? I want to note that, in my view, the international reaction and the unity on this issue is unprecedented in my 23 years of being a political scientist. I just have never seen such a unity of reaction to this kind of act of aggression. Maybe the closest thing is the initial support right after 9/11 for the U.S., but still, there's just a worldwide condemnation of Putin and his policies. And what does that mean? I think that there is more and more pressure to support Ukraine militarily. So not just support for the sanctions, but also support for NATO and other countries to supply Ukraine with lethal military assistance. So that means that I think we're likely to see more creative ways, just like we had during the Cold War, of connecting supplies with Ukrainians that stop short of a formal confrontation between NATO and Russia. And why is that important? Something you might see in the news is the issue of the no-fly zone, and the idea that the US or NATO should immediately impose a no-fly zone. And why is that problematic? I just want to note that a no-fly zone means no one is allowed to fly in a certain area. Ukraine as a territory is almost the size from, the East Coast to the Midwest. It's in terms of its length across. It's a huge territory. Okay, so if you say we're going to enforce a no-fly zone, it's a massive amount of force to do what? To shoot down any planes that are in that airspace, or to shoot down places where rockets or planes are launched from within Russia. So enforcing a no-fly zone actually means you're willing to shoot down Russian planes, which gets us into a direct NATO-Russia confrontation. Why is that a problem? Everybody should know that Russia is a nuclear power. NATO also has nuclear weapons. But given what we have seen of Putin's decision-making, can we totally take nuclear confrontation off the table? And I don't think we can. I don't think it's a high probability, but I wouldn't say the probability is zero given the kinds of calculations he's made thus far. So I think a cautious approach is important, and the cautious approach is to try to arm Ukraine, support them militarily, but still avoid this direct confrontation. I wish I had a more positive note to end on, but I guess I'll just say that I'll reiterate my view that I think Ukrainians are very much resolved to maintain their sovereignty and maintain their independence. And I don't think as a military objective, Russia is going to be able to actually control Ukraine in terms of governance, because he's going to continue to face Ukrainian opposition no matter how much damage he's inflicting on the country. Okay, I think I will leave it there, and that will leave us plenty of time for some questions. I'm not hearing you.
Okay, here we are. So I learned a lot from your presentation, and I hope everybody else did too. I'm going to be relaying any questions that I get to you, but I'll start with some of my own. And I want to start also by saying that I have questions that do not intend to absolve Putin of what he's done. But I would like to ask you the things I've been reading, questioning whether NATO ever really would take Ukraine under its wing. I know that they have to have certain things in order to gain membership, certain political, economic, and military goals. They have to have something to contribute. But if they had all those things to contribute, do you think that NATO has just been holding a carrot out there for them, or do you think that they would follow through?
Okay, it's a really great question, and it's a little bit of a complicated answer. What the Russians will point to is that there was a document in 2008 from the George W. Bush administration that said Ukraine will become part of NATO, period. And the same for Georgia. So the Russians always would point to this and say, you see, Ukraine is going to be part of NATO no matter what you say, because look, there's this 2008 document. The American side would say, well, that's kind of like a aspiration, like we'll see, we don't know, it depends, like you could be on a path, we'll see. But the thing is that NATO is a consensus-based organization. There's 30 members, and you would need 30 votes yes, not a single vote no, in order to do anything, which is also what is required for NATO to get involved directly in Ukraine and have a no-fly zone. So that's just an important decision-making rule to understand, is that there actually has to be a total unity among NATO members for admission. Now, Ukraine, until 2014, actually had moved back and forth in its orientation in terms of being pro-Russian, pro-Western, et cetera. The country was kind of divided. And so there were concerns in terms of people thinking about Ukraine joining NATO, of like, well, how reliable is Ukraine? What if they have an election where they elect a pro-Putin, pro-Russian president, and then how would that work in terms of an alliance? So there were various questions of feasibility of like, how would it actually work? Who would, the stability of the Ukrainian economy, issues of corruption and things like that. So I think that there wasn't in place, so there was a document, admittedly, there was a 2008 document, but in terms of a concrete plan for Ukraine to join NATO, there was not one. So that's what is a little bit puzzling and frankly strange about this whole conflict, is why would you make such a big deal of Ukraine joining NATO when it wasn't actually en route to join NATO? It's true that Ukraine had taken a more pro-European approach, but also, the EU has various problems, like they just had Brexit, there's, different things going on. So even EU admission was not a slam dunk for Ukraine, because they had a whole list of things that they would need to do in order to join even the EU. So not even a military alliance, but just even to join the EU. So the most likely scenario would have been for Ukraine to sort of like keep moving along and, see how things went. And so that's why the NATO issue is something that the Putin side has made a huge deal of. But so it's not that it doesn't matter to them. It does matter to Putin, but it was not objectively a threat to Russia. NATO was not a threat to Russia, and Ukraine was not a threat to Russia. And I think a lot of the rhetoric NATO saying, like, we're actually a defensive organization, has been borne out, because some of the East European states have said, you really can't trust Russia, et cetera. And a lot of people have thought, the likelihood of an invasion is so low. But, as it turns out in these days under Putin, NATO has become very important.
Okay, I have more questions, but I do want to encourage anybody online to ask questions. There's no such thing as a stupid question. We're just going to, try to learn here. One of the questions I have for you is, what do you think that the impact of social media has had on uniting the world on this issue?
Yeah, well, I think that I think this is an interesting thing, because in comparison, say, to Chechnya, when there wasn't like a lot of knowledge about what has happened, the damage that's being done is being widely documented and shared almost instantaneously. So there's just going to be no way to inflict a lot of civilian casualties and have nobody know about it. The other thing is that, as probably people know, people share things of interest to them. They share it with people they know. And you can't always predict, what will get people's attention, what won't. Why do some conflicts become something everybody cares about? So there's a certain amount of a certain haphazardness into why something becomes so meaningful. But it's clear that a lot of people in Europe and the US and other countries of the world have a sense of sympathy and solidarity for what's happening in Ukraine, which is different from other conflicts. For a lot of East European countries, they remember the Soviet invasion, the attempts to get rid of Soviet Union in 1956 and 1968, which failed in Hungary and Czechoslovakia. And there's still generations of people from World War II that are very much upset about the Soviet domination of those East European countries. So they don't take it lightly that Russia has invaded Ukraine. It's a very important and meaningful thing, and it brings up just a lot of painful personal memories for people. And then just the ability for social media to show people who look like you, who speak English, who are doing the things that you're doing, that just resonates with people. And certainly, of course, there is a racial identity element that I'm happy to talk about. But I just want to add that, like, the sympathy that people feel, I think, is real. It doesn't mean they shouldn't also feel sympathy for other people. But I think the social media networks have expanded the ability for people to see what's going on and to feel that pain.
So what do you think? Do the oligarchs have any influence of Putin? That would be my first question there. And then the second follow-up question to that is, does anybody have any influence over Putin to change course?
Yeah, so the thing about the oligarchs is a lot of them have their positions because of their loyalty to Putin. So they're in the place they are because they went along with everything else he's done thus far. If they complained, they're kicked out of the circle. Or if they got involved in politics at all, they sort of were out. However, there's kind of an informal contract that Putin was like, doing an okay job with the economy. He's allowing them to steal. He's allowing them to store their money offshore and things like that. He doesn't bother them. They don't bother him. Like, it's kind of all working. I think there's a lot of reporting right now that's talking about Putin's isolation. And I think you can see that from the visuals. So does anyone have influence over him? There's like a couple of people that people mention. But even those people, one wonders, like, how much influence do they have? I think if you're looking at regular business people, they don't have a lot of influence. Nevertheless, I would say I'm 100% in favor of the oligarch sanctions, just 100%. The UK today just announced sanctions against 7 people that amounted to, forgive me, but I think it was about $19 billion. And, that's a lot of money in terms of just their properties and whatnot in the UK and bank accounts and things like that. And I think the reason that those matter is that those oligarch sanctions are almost costless to us in the West. And they are a symbol of the inequality, corruption, and greed of the Putin regime. And I see zero reason to allow people who benefited from his regime to continue to live lavish lifestyles in the West. There's lots of things that can be done with that money. I mean, the opposition, main opposition leader, if you can say, he's so marginalized, Alexei Navalny, who Putin tried to assassinate last year, who's in prison, he's in prison because he went back to Russia instead of staying out of the country. And as soon as he got there, he was arrested. And now there's actually a show trial for him going on. But his organization, which focuses on corruption and fraud, has done a tremendous amount of research on oligarchs, their money, where it is. They just published something. Actually, they retweeted, talking about social media, something from the fall about Foreign Minister Lavrov's stepdaughter, and this lavish lifestyle that she's living in London. She's supposedly unemployed. Her mother's supposedly unemployed. But obviously they get their money from Lavrov. And there are laws in place that ask where income comes from. And you have to have an explanation. And so there are legal means to go after this kind of wealth. And even if it doesn't in itself topple the regime, I think that we're in a situation where we don't know what is going to be the last straw that breaks the camel's back. And putting pressure on the regime, including pressure on these oligarchs, I think is something that we should be doing just in terms of economic justice, even if the effect on Putin per se right now is not immediate.
Can you give us some hypothetical end scenarios Like, what are...
Yeah, this is very hard because given what we know about Putin, he's staked everything on this invasion. He could have walked away 2 weeks ago and claimed victory. He could have said, you know, we were disrespected in the 90s. Nobody took us seriously, but now everyone's listening to us. Look, all the foreign ministers, all the presidents are meeting with me. Everybody wants our opinion on Ukraine and NATO. And he could have just said, like, you know, now everyone's taking us seriously. We'll go home and, you know, bask in our imperial status. But instead, with this invasion, he's completely trashed the Russian economy. And what's his explanation going to be for that? And he's also, you know, adopted a strategy which didn't work. The initial strategy of just going in and hoping for the best and hoping they would be accepted. And so what can he do other than double down? That's, I think, the unfortunate, most likely scenario is for him to just keep, I mean, Russia still has a big army, just keep pushing, keep trying to take control. But the excuses that he's given, or the rationale that he's given, the denazification, for example, is a non-existent thing. So it can't be a military goal to denazify a place that is not actually run by Nazis. So they have to think there's going to be some way in which they will get control of Kiev, maybe kill Zelensky, weaken the resolve. But as I said, like, I do not see the Ukrainians backing down. And, you know, there's 44 million Ukrainians. So even with the large exodus, there's a lot of people there. There's a lot of territory. And so unfortunately, I think that the one of the scenarios will be continued fighting until the Russian state is weakened in some way, or until there's some further domestic pressure in Russia. But probably, I think the ramped up military pressure by the Ukrainian side is going to be what stops Putin.
So when I try to imagine what kind of concessions Ukraine could make or the world could make, it's very difficult to comprehend what that might be. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah. I mean, I was a person who literally until the last moments before the war started, even when Putin gave his speech on February 21st, saying, you know, all his crazy historical nonsense about Ukraine developing nuclear weapons, about Ukraine being a platform for NATO. And that's when he said he's going to recognize Luhansk and Donetsk, the two regions in the east. A lot of people thought, okay, well, maybe he would just like stick with the status quo, put Russian forces into the areas they already control, because there's been an ongoing war there since 2014. But whereas I think until 2 weeks ago, he probably might have gotten some concessions for recognition of Crimea, recognition of Donetsk and Luhansk. That I don't think that would have been easy, but I think that would have been a possibility. At this point, with the damage that he's inflicted on Ukraine, I don't see any enthusiasm on the Ukrainian side for accepting that. I mean, it's an unfortunate thing that when you have parties in a war and each side thinks that they can win, they don't have an incentive to make a deal. And so one of the sides needs to be weakened quite a bit in order for them to accept a deal. And so that's why I think, unfortunately, this may continue for some time. But on the other hand, we're only 2 weeks into it. There's still, there's definitely a lot of damage, but when we look at other wars and how long they've lasted, 2 weeks is not, that long in historical terms.
So I think I'd be remiss in not following up with you on daring to discuss what race may have to do with how we've responded.
Yeah. So I think there's a couple of different ways to think about this. One is that there's no question that the reception of Ukrainian refugees has been different in Europe than the reception, say, of Syrian refugees. Anybody that followed Syria saw that was just an incredibly tragic, horrific civil war. It caused internally displaced people as well as refugees outside the country. Assad continues to be a horrible, brutal dictator. And so you could say, people should, but a lot of countries did accept Syrian refugees, including Turkey, accepted a lot. So there has been you can't say that there was no humanitarian sympathy for Syria. There certainly was, but a lot of people have pointed out one, the just different level of treatment in terms of the sort of welcomingness, welcoming people into their houses, the pressure on governments, whether refugees are considered a problem or not. So I think that religion and ethnicity, skin color definitely played a role there. On the other hand, I think that Putin strangely underestimated this aspect of it, in that he thought, look at the way that the West responded to Syria, they're going to respond the same way. So in a way, I think he may have been blinded by the previous reception of refugees and into thinking this wouldn't work. Another thing I think, though, that is interesting is that Putin himself is very much looking down on Ukrainians and as like not doing the right thing, and as not deserving of statehood, etc. And I think he underestimates that there is very little anti-Ukrainian sentiment in America or in Europe, just because people don't have a strong sense of who Ukraine was until they became a target of his aggression. And so he may have some anti-Ukrainian sentiment himself, but that is not shared in the West. And I think that's another way in which he underestimated this. But the other thing I'll say is that I think it's an absolute fair point also if people point out, well, look at all the wrong things America did, look at the damage in Iraq, Afghanistan, look at the unfair treatment of Syrian versus Ukrainian refugees. But I just want to point out that, just the adage of two wrongs don't make a right does apply. I mean, if somebody was unwelcoming in the past, it doesn't mean, well, therefore they should be unwelcoming every next time, they deal with the refugee crisis. I think it's an appropriate conversation to have about war and peace and how we treat people and whether we are quick to military action or peaceful initiatives. But I think, on the other hand, we're pushed into a situation of just naked aggression here by Russia that I think demands a response, and that's part of it as well. It's not just, so I think it would be a mistake to reduce this just to a question of race or skin color, because there's other things involved. And there's also feelings of sympathy when you can identify with people because they seem just like you. I mean, that's another thing that's just a very human response that lots of people, myself included, there was a video a couple days ago of a girl in a subway station singing the Frozen song, and she had the same name as my daughter, who knew the same songs at that age, and still it's just so sad to see things like that. So I think that there's a human aspect to identification with people, and that happened in other cases too. It's not just only with Ukrainians. I think that finding a sense of shared humanity is what we have to all look for.
So I would like to ask if there's anybody that wants to help in some way, wants to donate, where would you suggest that they send their donations to? Yeah,
I think there are, this is something, one, I do think donations are important. So I think that there's a lot of ways to help Ukraine. And I guess there's a couple of, there are charities that people know about, like the International Red Cross. Then there are specific Ukrainian charities like Razom, RAZOM, which is a Ukrainian, an organization that is specifically trying to do humanitarian assistance in Ukraine. I'm an affiliate of the Center for Russia, East Europe, and Central Asia. at UW-Madison. On the CRECA website, they actually have a specific page listing different charities that, people have different kinds of interests, medical supplies, health services, helmets, weapons, different kinds of things. So on the CRECA website, there are, 10 different charities. There's, different kinds of initiatives. I personally also think that these media operations like the Kiev Independent News and some of the news organizations that are operating in Ukraine are important to support. There's Navalny's organization in Russia is, trying to do something from the other side. But I think actually a lot of media organizations too, after they run stories, they have their own portals from their, ABC or NBC News, et cetera, has these kinds of things. So I think, of course, it's important to not get, to be careful in giving money online and not to just answer anybody over the phone, et cetera. I certainly wouldn't do that. But I think if you go to a reputable website, that would be the way to go.
To that, I would just say too, there are some charity rating systems out there. One of them is charitywatch.org. Another one is charitynavigator.org. So those are places to go just to confirm that you're using your donations in the best way possible. I want to let you know, oops, I just lost your face. I want to let you know that there is a thank you from the public for this. There's a question here I think I've covered already. So thank you, Dr. Herrera, for presenting for us tonight. I do want to remind everybody that to join us again on Thursday, March 24th at 6:30 p.m. Central Time. We'll be streaming live from London with New York Times bestselling author Kate Moore about her most recent book titled The Women They Could Not Silence. It's a tale about a forgotten woman whose inspirational journey sparked lasting change in women's rights. Thank you, Dr. Herrera. I am much appreciative of you giving us your time tonight to help our community understand what's going on.
You're very welcome. Thank you.
Thank you. Good night.
Good night. Bye.
Bye-bye.